1876, New Mexico Territory. Thomas Caldwell had ink stains on his fingers when the screaming started. He'd been bent over the supply ledgers in the cramped quartermaster's office at Fort Stanton, carefully recording the previous week's ammunition expenditures in his precise, cramped handwriting. At 24 years old, Thomas had served the United States Army for 3 years without firing a single shot in anger. He was a clerk, not a soldier, a distinction that had saved him from the truly dangerous assignments, but had also marked him as something less than a man in the eyes of the hardened frontier troops who passed through the fort. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The screaming changed everything. Thomas dropped his pen, watching a line of black ink spread across the page like spilled blood. Through the single grimy window of his office, he could see smoke rising from the eastern wall, not the gray-white smoke of cooking fires or the blacksmith's forge, but the thick, oily black smoke that meant something was burning that shouldn't be. "Apache!" someone shouted, and then the shooting started. Thomas had never been in combat. He'd joined the army because his father, a Boston accountant, had secured him a position that would keep him far from the front lines of any conflict. "You're not built for fighting," his father had told him bluntly. "You're smart, careful, and you have a good head for numbers. Let the brutes do the killing. You'll have a career." His father had been right about one thing. Thomas wasn't built for fighting. At 5 feet 7 inches and barely 140 pounds, he looked more like a school teacher than a soldier. He'd never learned to ride well, couldn't shoot straight despite mandatory training, and had never so much as thrown a punch in his entire sheltered life. The closest he'd come to violence was watching 2 privates settle a dispute behind the stables, and even that had made him queasy. But now violence had come to him. Thomas stood frozen as chaos erupted outside. Through the window, he watched soldiers running in all directions. Lieutenant Briggs, the young officer who'd always treated Thomas with casual contempt, sprinted past with his sidearm drawn. 3 seconds later, an arrow took him in the throat. Briggs dropped like a puppet with cut strings, and Thomas felt his stomach heave. He should move. He should grab a weapon, barricade the door, do something. Instead, he stood paralyzed, watching his ink spread across the supply requisition forms he'd spent 3 hours perfecting. The door to his office exploded inward. Thomas stumbled backward, his hip slamming into the desk hard enough to knock over his inkwell. A warrior filled the doorway, an Apache man painted for war, his face a mask of red and black, a knife in his hand still wet with blood. The warrior's eyes locked onto Thomas, and for one crystalline moment, Thomas understood that he was about to die. He'd never kissed a woman. That was the thought that flashed through his mind as the warrior advanced. Not properly, anyway. There had been a girl named Margaret Holloway back in Boston, the daughter of one of his father's clients. She'd allowed Thomas to escort her to a church social once, and at the end of the evening, she'd offered her cheek for a chaste peck that had left Thomas's heart hammering for hours afterward. But Margaret had married a banker's son the following spring, and Thomas had shipped west before finding anyone else. He was going to die in New Mexico Territory, a virgin with ink-stained fingers, who'd never even held a woman's hand for longer than a formal greeting required. The warrior raised his knife, and then something massive hit the warrior from the side, sending him crashing into the door frame with bone-breaking force. Thomas couldn't process what he was seeing at first. Another Apache had entered the office, but this one was different. Taller, broader, moving with the fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone so large. It took him several long seconds to realize that this new warrior was a woman. She stood at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller. It was hard to tell in the confined space of the office. Her arms were roped with muscle that flexed as she grabbed the male warrior by his throat and slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. She wore buckskin leggings and a simple cloth tunic that left her powerful shoulders bare, and her long black hair was bound back with a strip of red cloth. Thomas watched, unable to move or speak, as she dispatched the male warrior with brutal efficiency. Her movements were economical, precise. She wasn't fighting in rage, but with the calm competence of someone performing a familiar task. When she finally released him, the warrior slumped to the floor and didn't move. Then she turned to look at Thomas. Her face was broad and strong-boned, with high cheekbones and a square jaw that spoke of both beauty and power. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and they studied Thomas with an intensity that made him feel like an insect pinned to a collector's board. She was, he realized with a distant sort of shock, probably close to his own age despite the hardness in her expression. She said something in Apache, her voice deep and commanding. Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His legs felt like water, and he was distantly aware that he was trembling. The woman stepped over the dead warrior's body and moved closer. Thomas pressed back against his desk, knocking papers to the floor. She was so close now that he could see the fine sheen of sweat on her skin, smell the mixture of leather and smoke, and something else he couldn't identify. When she reached out, he flinched, but she was faster than his fear. Her hand closed around his wrist. It was the first time in Thomas's life that a woman had touched him with anything other than formal politeness, and even through his terror, he registered the shocking heat of her skin, the calloused strength of her fingers. She pulled him away from the desk as easily as he might have moved a child, examining him with that same intense scrutiny. She spoke again, her tone questioning this time. Thomas shook his head helplessly. I don't understand, he managed to croak. Outside, the sounds of the battle were intensifying, more screaming, more gunfire. Thomas could hear Lieutenant Morrison shouting orders, could smell the smoke growing thicker. The fort was burning, and he was trapped in a tiny office with a woman who just killed a man with her bare hands. The woman seemed to reach some kind of decision. She yanked Thomas toward the door, and he stumbled after her, too shocked to resist. They emerged into chaos. Fort Stanton was dying. Fires burned in 3 different locations, sending columns of smoke into the pale desert sky. Bodies lay scattered across the parade ground, some in army blue, some in the earth-toned garb of Apache warriors. Thomas saw Sergeant Williamson, who taught him how to properly fill out a requisition form, lying face down with an arrow in his back. He saw Private Morrison, barely 18 years old, clutching his stomach as blood seeped between his fingers. The woman dragged Thomas across the compound with single-minded determination. Warriors called out to her in Apache, and she shouted back without slowing. Thomas had no idea what they were saying, but he caught the tone, surprise, maybe disapproval. A few of the warriors looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt. They reached the eastern wall, where a section had been blown apart by what must have been smuggled dynamite. The woman pulled Thomas through the gap, and suddenly they were outside the fort, moving into the scrubland beyond. "Wait," Thomas tried to say. "Please, I can't." She didn't wait. She didn't even slow down. Thomas's boots, designed for standing at a desk rather than running across rough terrain, caught on rocks and sage bushes. He tripped, nearly fell, and would have face planted into the dirt if the woman's iron grip on his wrist hadn't kept him upright. Behind them, Fort Stanton continued to burn. Thomas looked back once and saw the flag falling as the flagpole collapsed into flames. 3 years of his life gone. His books, his carefully maintained records, his letters from home, all of it burning. The woman pulled him onward, and Thomas had no choice but to follow. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Thomas's lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, and a stitch in his side felt like someone had buried a knife between his ribs. The woman never slowed, never showed any sign of fatigue. She moved across the desert landscape like she'd been born to it, her stride eating up ground while Thomas gasped and stumbled behind her. Finally, mercifully, she stopped. They'd reached a small canyon, hidden behind a tumble of red rock that would have been invisible from a distance. The woman released Thomas's wrist, and he immediately collapsed onto his hands and knees, gasping for air. His vision swam with black spots, and he thought he might vomit. The woman stood over him, not even breathing hard. She said something in Apache, her tone almost amused. Thomas looked up at her through sweat-stung eyes. Now that they'd stopped, now that his immediate terror had faded to a dull roar, he could think more clearly. She'd killed one of her own people to save him. Why? Apache raiders didn't take prisoners unless they had a specific reason. He'd heard enough stories from the soldiers to know that much, and they certainly didn't have women warriors who stood 6 feet tall and could snap a man's neck with their bare hands. Except, apparently they did. The woman crouched down in front of him, and Thomas fought the urge to scramble backward. Up close, she was even more imposing. The muscles in her thighs were like iron cables beneath her leggings. Her hands, resting casually on her knees, looked like they could crush stone. She reached out, and Thomas flinched again. But she only touched his face, tilting his chin up so she could study him more closely. Her fingers were surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength. She traced the line of his jaw, brushed his sweat-dampened hair back from his forehead, examined him like she was assessing livestock at a market. Thomas's heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. No woman had ever touched him like this, with such casual intimacy, such obvious ownership. It was terrifying and electrifying in equal measure. She smiled. It was the first time Thomas had seen her smile, and it transformed her face from beautiful to devastating. The smile reached her eyes, lighting them with something that looked almost like satisfaction, or maybe anticipation. She spoke again, and this time she placed her palm flat against Thomas's chest, right over his racing heart. The meaning was clear even without translation. Mine. Thomas Caldwell, 24 years old, Army clerk, virgin, had just been claimed by an Apache warrior woman who looked at him like he was something precious she'd won in battle. And the most terrifying part? Somewhere beneath the fear and shock and exhaustion, some small, traitorous part of him was thrilled. The sun was setting when they reached the camp. Thomas had barely managed to keep pace as the woman led him deeper into the canyon system, following paths that seemed invisible to his untrained eyes. His throat was raw with thirst, his lips cracked and bleeding. The woman had offered him water once from a leather pouch at her hip, holding it to his mouth like he was a child. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but Thomas had never been so grateful for anything in his life. Now, as they descended into a wider canyon where firelight flickered against red stone walls, Thomas saw that they weren't alone. A dozen Apache warriors were gathered around 3 fires, some tending to wounds, others cleaning weapons or preparing food. They looked up as the woman appeared, and Thomas felt every pair of eyes lock onto him. The conversation stopped. One warrior, a lean man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, said something sharp and questioning. The woman responded without breaking stride, her tone brooking no argument. She kept her hand firmly wrapped around Thomas's wrist as she pulled him toward the largest fire, where an older woman sat grinding something in a stone bowl. Thomas understood enough from the body language to know that his presence here was controversial. Several of the warriors were openly hostile, their hands moving to their weapons. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Others looked merely confused, their eyes traveling between the tall woman and Thomas with expressions of disbelief. The woman pushed Thomas down to sit on a flat rock near the fire, then turned to face the other warriors. What followed was clearly an argument, though Thomas couldn't understand a word of it. The woman's voice never rose, but there was steel in it, a quiet command that seemed to demand respect. The scarred warrior gestured angrily at Thomas several times, his voice rising in what sounded like protest or disgust. Through it all, the older woman by the fire kept grinding, occasionally glancing at Thomas with an expression that might have been amusement. Finally, the tall woman said something final and definitive, then turned her back on the scarred warrior, a dismissal so complete it was almost insulting. She returned to Thomas and crouched in front of him again, studying his face in the firelight. Up close, with the flames casting shadows across her features, she was stunning. Thomas had never seen a woman like her, had never imagined a woman like her could exist. Every woman he'd known in Boston had been corseted and proper, moving through the world with careful restraint. This woman moved like a thunderstorm, powerful and uncontained. She touched his face again, her calloused fingers tracing his cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. Then she spoke, slowly and clearly, pointing to herself. Kaya. It took Thomas a moment to understand. She was telling him her name. Kaya, he repeated, his voice hoarse. She smiled that devastating smile again and nodded. Then she pointed at him, her eyebrows raised in question. Thomas, he managed. Thomas Caldwell. She tried the name, her accent turning it into something exotic and unfamiliar. Thomas. She seemed pleased with this, repeating it once more before rising to her feet. Kaya, if he'd understood correctly, moved to speak with the older woman, leaving Thomas sitting awkwardly by the fire. He was acutely aware of being watched by every warrior in the camp, could feel their eyes on him like physical weight. One younger warrior, barely more than a boy, actually laughed and said something that made several others chuckle darkly. Thomas stared at his hands, at the ink stains that still marked his fingers, even after everything that had happened. He'd woken up that morning planning to finish the quarterly supply report. Now he was sitting in an Apache camp, claimed by a warrior woman for reasons he couldn't begin to understand, while Fort Stanton burned somewhere behind them. He should be terrified. He was terrified, but beneath the fear was something else, something he didn't have a name for. When Kaya had touched his face, when she'd smiled at him, he'd felt a jolt of something electric run through his entire body. It wasn't just fear. It was something far more dangerous. Kaya returned with food, some kind of flatbread and strips of dried meat. She handed them to Thomas, watching as he ate. The meat was tough and gamey, nothing like the beef served in the fort's mess hall. But Thomas's stomach was empty enough that he didn't care. He ate mechanically, aware of Kaya's constant attention. When he'd finished, she produced the water pouch again and let him drink his fill. Then she stood and extended her hand to him, not grabbing his wrist this time, but offering her palm up in a gesture that was almost courtly. Thomas hesitated, then placed his hand in hers. Her fingers closed around his, and she pulled him to his feet with effortless strength. She led him away from the main fires, toward the far end of the canyon where the firelight barely reached. Thomas's heart began hammering again as he realized they were moving away from the others, toward a small shelter constructed of branches and hides. It was crude by the standards he was used to, but it looked solid and well made. Kaya ducked inside, pulling Thomas after her. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the distant fires filtering through gaps in the hide covering. There were blankets spread on the ground, a few leather bags stacked against one wall, and a knife in a beaded sheath hanging from one of the support poles. Kaya released Thomas's hand and began removing her weapons. A knife from her belt, another from her boot, a small hatchet he hadn't even noticed. She set them aside carefully, then turned to face him. Thomas stood frozen, his back pressed against the far wall of the shelter. His mind was racing, cataloging every terrible thing he'd heard about Apache captives, every horror story the soldiers had whispered around their fires. But Kaya hadn't hurt him, hadn't even threatened him. She'd given him water and food, had argued with her own people on his behalf. She stepped closer, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Kaya reached out and began unbuttoning his uniform jacket with surprising dexterity. Her fingers worked the buttons with practiced ease, and Thomas realized with a shock that she must have taken clothes from soldiers before, from living prisoners or dead bodies. He didn't want to consider which. "Wait," he whispered, but his voice had no strength behind it. She ignored him, peeling the jacket off his shoulders and tossing it aside. Then she started on his shirt, pulling it free from his trousers. When her hands touched the bare skin of his chest, Thomas actually gasped. No one had ever touched him there. No one had ever touched him anywhere, except through layers of clothing and propriety. Kaya paused, her eyes meeting his. There was a question in her gaze, but also something implacable. She was giving him a moment to understand what was happening, but she wasn't asking permission. "I've never," Thomas started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. His face burned with humiliation. Something shifted in Kaya's expression. The hard edge softened slightly, and she tilted her head, studying him with new understanding. She said something in Apache, her tone gentler now, almost reassuring. Then she pushed him down onto the blankets. Thomas landed on his back, his heart hammering so hard he thought he might die of it. Kaya stood over him, silhouetted against the faint light from outside, and began unlacing her tunic. The garment fell away, and Thomas's mind simply stopped working. She was magnificent, all muscle, and curves and smooth brown skin that seemed to glow in the dim light. She was nothing like the marble statues he'd seen in books, nothing like the corseted figures of Boston women. She was raw and powerful and absolutely terrifying. Kaya knelt beside him, and her hands returned to his clothes. This time Thomas didn't protest as she stripped him with efficient competence, removing each layer until he lay completely exposed and vulnerable beneath her gaze. She examined him the way she'd examined his face earlier, with thorough, unhurried attention. Her hands traced the lines of his ribs, the hollow of his throat, the trembling muscles of his stomach. Everywhere she touched felt like it was on fire. When she finally stretched out beside him, her body pressed against his. Thomas made a sound he'd never made before. Half gasp, half moan, entirely involuntary. The heat of her skin against his was overwhelming. The solid weight of her was impossible. Kaya's hand cupped his face, turning his head so he had to meet her eyes. In the darkness, they were bottomless. She said something in Apache, and though Thomas didn't know the words, he understood the meaning. Mine. You are mine now. Then she kissed him. It was nothing like the chaste peck Margaret Holloway had allowed. Kaya's mouth was demanding, claiming, showing Thomas exactly what she wanted from him. Her hand tangled in his hair, holding him in place, and her body pressed against his with unmistakable intent. Thomas's entire world narrowed to the sensation of her mouth, her hands, her weight, her heat. His mind couldn't process it, couldn't categorize it, couldn't fit it into any framework he understood. So his mind simply surrendered, and his body took over. His hands, which had been lying uselessly at his sides, finally moved. They touched her shoulders, traced the powerful muscles of her back, discovered the curve of her waist. She felt like warm stone beneath his tentative fingers, solid and unyielding and absolutely real. Kaya made a sound of approval deep in her throat and pressed closer. Her hands explored him with far more confidence than his explored her, mapping his body with the same thorough attention she'd given everything else. When her fingers traveled lower, Thomas actually whimpered. She pulled back slightly, and Thomas could see her smile in the darkness. Satisfied, possessive, hungry. What happened next was a blur of sensation that Thomas's inexperienced mind could barely comprehend. Kaya was neither gentle nor cruel. She was patient in some moments and demanding in others, teaching him without words what she wanted, showing him how to touch her, how to move with her. When he fumbled or hesitated, she guided his hands with hers. When he moved correctly, she rewarded him with sounds and touches that made his entire body sing. Thomas had read books. He understood the basic mechanics of what occurred between men and women. But reading about something and experiencing it were entirely different things. Nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming physicality of it, the way his body seemed to know things his mind didn't, the way pleasure and fear and wonder could all exist in the same moment. And nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for Kaya. She moved with the same powerful grace she'd shown in everything else, taking what she wanted while simultaneously giving more than Thomas knew how to receive. She was dominant without being domineering, demanding without being cruel. She took control completely, and Thomas surrendered it just as completely, lost in sensations he'd never imagined. When it was finally over, Thomas lay gasping and trembling, his entire body covered in sweat despite the cool desert night. Kaya lay beside him, one heavy arm thrown across his chest in a gesture of possessive contentment. Her breathing was deep and even, already beginning to slow toward sleep. Thomas stared at the hide ceiling of the shelter, his mind trying desperately to catch up with what had just happened to him. In the space of one day, he'd gone from a Virgin Army clerk to the, what? Property, captive, lover. He didn't even know what word to use for what he'd become. Kai's arm tightened around him, pulling him closer against her side. Even in sleep, she was claiming him, keeping him close. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to slow his racing heart. Tomorrow, he would have to think about escape, about getting back to civilization, about what came next. Tomorrow, he would have to face the reality of his situation. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of an Apache warrior woman who'd decided he belonged to her, Thomas Caldwell finally understood what it meant to be wanted by someone who saw you not as you pretended to be, but as you actually were, small and frightened and completely out of your depth. And the most terrifying thing of all was that some part of him didn't want to escape. Some part of him wanted to stay right here, claimed and possessed and utterly transformed by a woman who moved through the world like a force of nature. Outside, the night sounds of the desert filtered into the shelter, crickets and distant coyotes, and the low murmur of warriors talking around the fires. Inside, Thomas let himself drift toward sleep, still held fast in Kaya's unbreakable grip. His old life was gone. Whatever came next, he would face it as someone new, someone who'd been chosen, claimed, and fundamentally changed by a single day in the New Mexico desert. Thomas woke to the smell of smoke and cooking meat. For one disoriented moment, he thought he was back in his bunk at Fort Stanton, that everything had been a nightmare. Then he felt the rough wool blanket against his bare skin, felt the warm weight pressed against his back, and reality came crashing down. Kaya was still asleep, her body curved around his like a shield. One of her arms was draped over his waist, her hand resting possessively on his stomach. In sleep, some of the hardness had left her face, making her look younger, almost peaceful. Thomas carefully extracted himself from her grip and reached for his clothes. His uniform was crumpled and dirty, the brass buttons tarnished from yesterday's chaos. As he dressed, his body reminded him of everything that had happened the night before, muscles aching in places he hadn't known could ache, skin tender where Kaya's hands and mouth had been. He was buttoning his shirt when Kaya's eyes opened. She watched him dress with lazy interest, making no move to cover herself. When Thomas's gaze accidentally swept across her body, she smiled knowingly and said something in Apache that sounded amused. Thomas's face burned as he looked away, even after last night. The casual nudity felt shocking to his Boston-bred sensibilities. Kaya rose and dressed with quick efficiency, transforming from relaxed lover to warrior in seconds. She strapped on her weapons, tied back her hair, and gestured for Thomas to follow her outside. The camp was already awake. Warriors moved about their morning tasks, sharpening weapons, tending fires, preparing food. The older woman from last night was working on what looked like a deer skin, scraping it with a curved blade. when she saw Thomas emerge from Kaya's shelter. She called out something that made several nearby warriors laugh. Kaya responded sharply, silencing the laughter. She led Thomas to one of the fires where food was being prepared. More of the flatbread and some kind of stew made with corn and dried meat. Thomas ate mechanically, aware of dozens of eyes watching his every move. The scarred warrior from last night approached, speaking rapidly to Kaya. His tone was aggressive, his gestures sharp and angry. Thomas didn't need to understand Apache to know the man was arguing about him again. Kaya's response was short and final. The scarred warrior's face darkened with fury, but he turned and stalked away without another word. Thomas noticed that several other warriors watched this exchange with varying expressions, some approving, others troubled. After they'd eaten, Kaya pulled Thomas to his feet and led him out of the main camp area. They climbed up out of the canyon, moving into the scrubland beyond. Thomas struggled to keep pace, his city-bred lungs burning in the thin desert air, his unsuitable boots slipping on loose rock. Kaya moved like she was part of the landscape itself, never hesitating, never uncertain. She led him to a flat area surrounded by red boulders and stopped, turning to face him. Then she drew her knife. Thomas's heart lurched into his throat. Had she changed her mind? Had last night been some kind of test he'd failed? He took an involuntary step backward, and Kaya's expression shifted to something that might have been exasperation. She reversed the knife and held it out to him. Handle first. Thomas stared at the weapon, confused. Kaya thrust it toward him again, more insistently, and mimed a stabbing motion. Then she pointed at herself and spread her arms wide, clearly offering herself as a target. Understanding dawned slowly. She wanted him to attack her. "I can't," Thomas said, shaking his head. "I don't know how to..." Kaya grabbed his wrist and slapped the knife handle into his palm, closing his fingers around it. Then she stepped back and gestured again. "Attack me." Thomas held the knife awkwardly, having no idea what he was doing. He'd never held a weapon with the intent to use it. Even in the Army's mandatory training, he'd always found ways to avoid the hand-to-hand combat exercises. Kaya barked something that sounded like a command. When Thomas still hesitated, she moved forward and slapped him across the face. It wasn't hard enough to really hurt, but the shock of it sent Thomas stumbling backward. No one had ever struck him before. The indignity of it sparked something hot in his chest. Anger, maybe, or wounded pride. Kaya gestured again, more insistently. "Attack me." Thomas lunged forward clumsily, the knife extended in what was probably the worst stabbing form imaginable. Kaya sidestepped with contemptuous ease and swept his legs out from under him. Thomas hit the ground hard, the air exploding from his lungs, the knife flying from his grip. Before he could recover, Kaya was on him, one knee on his chest, her hand at his throat. She held the position for a long moment, making her point clear. "You're helpless." Then she released him and stood, retrieving the knife. They repeated this pattern for what felt like hours. Kaya would give Thomas the knife, motion for him to attack, and then systematically dismantle every clumsy attempt he made. She tripped him, disarmed him, threw him, pinned him. Each time she held him down just long enough for him to understand how completely outmatched he was, then released him and started again. By midday, Thomas was covered in dust and bruises, his body screaming in protest. His uniform was torn in several places, his hands scraped raw from catching himself during falls. But something was beginning to shift. His movements were becoming slightly less awkward. He was starting to anticipate some of Kai's counters, even if he couldn't prevent them. When the sun reached its peak, Kai finally called a halt. She led Thomas to a small spring hidden among the rocks and let him drink. The water was cold and clear, and Thomas gulped it down gratefully. When he'd finished, Kaya stripped off her tunic and splashed water over her face and arms, washing away the dust. Thomas tried not to stare and failed completely. Even here, covered in dirt and sweat from their training session, she was magnificent. Kaya caught him looking and smiled. She said something in Apache, her tone teasing, then gestured for him to remove his own shirt. When Thomas hesitated, she simply reached over and started unbuttoning it herself. They washed in the spring, and despite his exhaustion, despite the bruises covering his body, Thomas felt that same electric current when Kaya's wet hands touched his skin. She seemed to enjoy his reactions, deliberately brushing against him in ways that made his breath catch. But she didn't push further. Instead, she handed him his damp shirt and led him back toward camp, her hand wrapped firmly around his wrist as always. The afternoon brought new lessons. Kaya took Thomas to where the older woman was working on the deerskin and gestured for him to watch. The woman, whose name Thomas eventually learned was Nietzsche, showed him how to scrape the hide, how to work the leather until it was soft. His desk-trained hands were useless at first, too soft and unpracticed for the work. Nietzsche laughed at his fumbling attempts, but not unkindly, correcting his grip and showing him again. Other tasks followed. Kaya had Thomas help gather firewood, teaching him which types of brush burned best. She showed him how to identify certain plants, which were edible, which were medicinal, which would make him sick. She demonstrated how to move quietly across rocky ground, how to read tracks in the dust. Thomas understood what she was doing. She was teaching him to survive here, not as a prisoner waiting for rescue, but as someone who belonged. The realization should have troubled him more than it did. As evening approached, the warriors began returning from whatever activities had occupied their day. The scarred warrior, Thomas had learned his name was Goyakla, came back with 2 rabbits and a string of quail. He made a point of ignoring Thomas completely, speaking only to the other men. During the evening meal, Kaya sat with Thomas slightly apart from the main group. She tore off pieces of roasted rabbit and fed them to him, watching him eat with that same intense attention she gave everything. When Thomas tried to feed himself, she pushed his hand away and continued offering him food directly from her fingers. The gesture was intimate and possessive, and Thomas was acutely aware that every warrior in the camp could see it. Kaya was making a statement. This man is mine. I provide for him. He is under my protection. After they'd eaten, a young warrior produced a drum and began to play. Others joined in with rattles and voices, and some began to dance around the fire. The rhythm was hypnotic, utterly unlike the structured melodies Thomas knew from church socials and formal dances. Kaya stood and pulled Thomas to his feet. Before he could protest, she'd drawn him into the circle of dancers. Thomas had no idea what he was doing, but Kaya guided him with her hands on his waist, showing him the basic steps. He stumbled and faltered, but she was patient, pulling him back into rhythm when he lost it. The other dancers made room for them, and Thomas realized with shock that some of the warriors were actually smiling. Not all of them. Goyakla and a few others watched with open hostility, but enough to suggest that maybe, possibly, He was beginning to be accepted, or at least tolerated. As they danced, Kaya's body pressed against his, moving with the drum's rhythm. The firelight turned her skin to gold and shadow, and Thomas found himself mesmerized by the play of light across her features. When she looked down at him, because she was taller, would always be taller, her expression was possessive and satisfied, and something else he couldn't quite name. The dancing continued until late into the night, but eventually Kaya led Thomas back to her shelter. Inside, she undressed him again with the same efficient competence as before. This time, Thomas's hands were steadier as they explored her body. He was learning what she liked, where to touch, how to move. He was still clumsy and uncertain, but Kaya seemed pleased with his progress. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Thomas found himself speaking, even though he knew she couldn't understand most of his words. "I should want to escape," he said quietly. "I should be planning how to get back to civilization. That's what I'm supposed to do." Kaya's hand traced lazy patterns on his chest, her breathing deep and even. "But I don't know if I want to go back," Thomas continued. "Back to ledgers and ink stains and people who look at me like I'm barely worth noticing. Here, you look at me like I'm something valuable, something worth keeping." He paused, struggling with thoughts he'd never articulated before, even to himself. "My father always said I wasn't built for the real world, that I needed to hide behind a desk where I couldn't get hurt. Maybe he was right, but you don't seem to think I'm useless. You're trying to teach me, to make me stronger." Kaya's hand stilled on his chest. She said something in Apache, her voice soft in the darkness. Thomas had no idea what the words meant, but the tone was gentle, almost tender. "I don't know what happens next," Thomas whispered. "I don't know if I can become what you want me to be, but I think I want to try." Kaya shifted, rising up on one elbow to look down at him. In the faint light filtering through the shelter, her eyes were unreadable. She touched his face with her free hand, her calloused fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Then she leaned down and kissed him, slowly this time, without the demanding urgency of before. When she pulled back, she said one word: "Thomas." His name in her accent, a claim and a promise. Thomas reached up and touched her face in return, mirroring her gesture. "Kaya," he said. She smiled and settled back down beside him, her arm returning to its possessive position across his chest. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Thomas lay awake longer, staring at the darkness and thinking about the impossible situation he found himself in. 2 days ago, he'd been a nobody clerk in an isolated fort, invisible to everyone around him. Now he was lying in an Apache camp, claimed by a warrior woman who terrified and fascinated him in equal measure, learning to survive in a world he'd never imagined. He should be planning escape, should be thinking about duty and loyalty to the army and the civilization he'd come from. Instead, he was thinking about the way Kaya's hand felt on his skin, the way she looked at him like he mattered, the way his body was already beginning to change under her brutal training regimen. Thomas closed his eyes and let sleep take him, still held fast in Kaya's unbreakable grip, still claimed and possessed and utterly transformed. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new steps away from the man he'd been and towards something he couldn't yet name. But tonight, he let himself simply exist in this impossible moment. Wanted, chosen, and for the first time in his life, completely alive. The fourth day began with rain. Thomas woke to the sound of water drumming against the hide covering of the shelter, a steady rhythm that spoke of a storm that had settled in for the long haul. Kaya was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the entrance, sharpening her knife with long practiced strokes against a whetstone. She glanced over when Thomas stirred, and something in her expression made him wary. There was a determination there, a sense of purpose that felt different from the previous days. "Thomas," she said, then gestured for him to come closer. Thomas dressed quickly and joined her by the entrance. Outside, the camp was a study in gray sky, gray rain. Warriors moving through the downpour wrapped in blankets or hides. The fires had been moved under crude shelters, smoke rising sluggishly in the damp air. Kaya stood and pulled on a leather cape that shed water like duck feathers. Then she handed Thomas a similar garment, smaller, clearly not made for someone her size. It took him a moment to realize it must have come from another soldier, stripped from a body or a captive. The thought should have disturbed him more than it did. They left the shelter and moved through the rain-soaked camp. Warriors looked up as they passed, and Thomas noticed something different in their expressions today. There was anticipation there, a kind of expectant attention that made his stomach clench with anxiety. Kaya led him up out of the canyon, following a narrow trail that became treacherous with mud and running water. Thomas slipped twice, catching himself on rocks that scraped his palms raw. Kaya never slowed, never looked back to check if he was keeping up. She expected him to follow, and so he did. They climbed for nearly an hour, the rain never letting up. Thomas's clothes were soaked through beneath the leather cape, his boots squelching with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps as the altitude and exertion took their toll. Finally, they emerged onto a plateau overlooking the canyon system below. The view was spectacular even through the rain, red rock formations stretching to the horizon. The desert transformed into something primal and beautiful by the storm. Kaya stopped and turned to face him. Water ran down her face, plastering her hair against her skull, but she seemed entirely unbothered by the downpour. She drew her knife and held it out to Thomas, handle first. They'd done this before. Thomas had thought he was getting better at combat training, starting to understand the basics of balance and movement. But something about Kaya's expression told him today was different. Thomas took the knife, his wet grip slipping slightly on the handle. Kaya stepped back and drew her own blade, a longer knife, almost a short sword that Thomas hadn't seen before. Then she gestured, and her meaning was clear. "This time, we fight for real." Thomas's mouth went dry. "Kaya, I can't." She didn't wait for him to finish. She came at him fast and hard, her blade flashing in the gray light. Thomas stumbled backward, barely managing to deflect her strike. The force of it sent painful vibrations up his arm. She pressed the attack, driving him back across the muddy plateau. Thomas's feet slipped and slid, his attempts at defense clumsy and desperate. This wasn't like the previous training sessions where Kaya had been teaching him, correcting his form, showing him how to improve. This was real combat, and she was holding nothing back. Thomas tried to remember everything she'd taught him. Keep your weight centered. Don't overextend. Watch your opponent's eyes, not their weapon. But theory crumbled under the reality of Kaya's assault. She was everywhere at once, her blade a silver blur that seemed to come from impossible angles. A slash opened up his sleeve, missing his arm by inches. Another cut through the leather cape, close enough that he felt the wind of it. Thomas was in full retreat now, his heart hammering, his breath coming in panicked gasps. Then his foot caught on a rock and he went down hard, landing on his back in the mud. His knife flew from his grip, skittering across wet stone. Kaya was on him instantly, her knee on his chest, her blade at his throat. The metal was cold against his skin, pressed just hard enough that he could feel his pulse beating against it. Thomas lay frozen, staring up at her. Rain ran down her face, dripped from her chin onto his. Her eyes were hard and bright, utterly pitiless. She held him there for what felt like an eternity. Then she said something in Apache. A question, based on the inflection. Thomas had no idea what she was asking. "I don't understand," he gasped. Kaya pressed the blade a fraction harder. A thin line of pain told Thomas she'd broken skin. She repeated the question, more insistently. "I don't know what you want," Thomas said, hating the way his voice shook. Kaya's eyes searched his face, looking for something. Then, finally, she removed the knife from his throat and stood. But she didn't help him up. Instead, she walked several paces away and stood with her back to him, waiting. Thomas pushed himself into a sitting position, mud coating his back and sides. His hand went to his throat, came away with a smear of blood. The cut was shallow, barely more than a scratch, but the message was clear. He could have died. Kaya could have killed him at any moment during that fight. Could kill him right now if she chose. Thomas looked at his empty hands, then at his knife lying in the mud several feet away. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. He retrieved the knife, wiping the mud from the blade with his soaked sleeve. Kaya still stood with her back to him, completely vulnerable, completely trusting or testing him. Thomas stood there, knife in hand, staring at her undefended back. He could attack her, should probably try to attack her. That seemed to be what this exercise was about. But every instinct he had screamed against it. Attacking someone from behind felt fundamentally wrong, dishonorable. Instead, he walked around to face her. "I'm ready," he said quietly. Kaya's expression shifted. Something that might have been approval flickered across her features. She raised her blade again and nodded. They fought again, and again, and again. Each time, Kaya drove Thomas to his limits and then past them. She was teaching him something, though he couldn't articulate what. Not just how to fight, but something deeper. How to fall and get back up. How to keep moving even when every muscle screamed in protest. How to function through fear and pain and exhaustion. By the time Kaya finally called a halt, Thomas could barely stand. He'd been cut a dozen times. Nothing serious, but enough to sting and bleed. His body was one massive bruise, his clothes torn and muddy beyond recognition. Kaya approached him and took the knife from his shaking hands. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the cut on his throat, her fingers surprisingly gentle. She said something in Apache, and though Thomas didn't know the words, he understood the tone. You did well. The walk back to camp was a blur of exhaustion. Thomas stumbled more than walked, barely aware of his surroundings. Kaya had to support him for the last section of the descent, her arm around his waist, essentially carrying his weight. When they reached camp, Naichi took one look at Thomas and immediately began giving orders. Warriors scattered to fetch things: water, cloths, what looked like medicinal herbs. Kaya carried Thomas into her shelter and laid him down on the blankets. What followed was both painful and oddly intimate. Kaya stripped away his ruined clothes, and Naichi came in to help clean and treat his various cuts and scrapes. The older woman worked with brisk efficiency, applying stinging poultices that made Thomas bite back groans. Through it all, Kaya sat beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder, a constant, grounding presence. When Naichi had finished and left, Kaya brought Thomas food and water. He was too exhausted to feed himself, so she did it for him again, patient and thorough. Then she lay down beside him, pulling him against her body, and began to speak. It took Thomas a moment to realize she was teaching him Apache words. She would point to something, his hand, her hair, the blanket, the shelter wall, and say the word in her language, then wait for him to repeat it. When he got it right, she would nod approvingly. When he got it wrong, she would correct him until he could pronounce it properly. They continued this lesson until Thomas's eyes began to close despite his best efforts to stay awake. The last thing he remembered was Kaya saying something soft in Apache, her hand stroking his damp hair with unexpected tenderness. He woke in the middle of the night to voices outside the shelter, angry voices speaking in rapid Apache. Thomas recognized Goyekla's distinctive tone, sharp with fury. Someone else responded, and then Kaya's voice cut through, hard as iron. The argument escalated. Thomas heard other warriors joining in. The camp apparently divided on whatever issue was being debated. Through it all, Kaya's voice remained steady and implacable, refusing to back down. Finally, Goyakla said something that sounded like a challenge, his voice rising to a shout. There was a long moment of silence, and then Kaya responded with a single word that cut through the night like a blade. More silence, then the sound of footsteps retreating. The camp gradually settled back into quiet. Kaya returned to the shelter, and in the darkness, Thomas could feel the tension radiating from her body. She lay down beside him, pulling him against her more tightly than usual, almost possessively. "What's happening?" Thomas whispered. Kaya didn't answer, or maybe she didn't understand the question, but her arms tightened around him, and Thomas understood that whatever argument had just occurred, it had been about him. The camp was dividing over his presence here. Some warriors accepting him, others violently opposed, and Kaya was standing against her own people to keep him. The realization made something in Thomas's chest tighten painfully. She was risking her standing, possibly her safety, for a man she'd known less than a week. A man who couldn't even speak her language properly, who was useless in a fight, who brought nothing but trouble to her people. Why? What did she see in him that was worth this conflict? Thomas wanted to ask, but he had no words for the question, not in English or Apache. Instead, he turned in her arms until he faced her, until he could see her eyes in the faint starlight filtering through gaps in the shelter. "Kaya," he said softly, and then, searching for the right Apache word from her earlier lesson, "Thank you." It came out wrong. his accent butchering the pronunciation. But Kaya understood. Her expression softened, and she touched his face with one calloused hand. She said something in Apache, several sentences, spoken quietly but with intensity. Thomas caught maybe one word in 10, but he understood the essential meaning. You are mine. I protect what is mine. No one will take you from me. Then she kissed him, and the kiss was different from the others, less demanding, more tender, a promise rather than a claim. When they finally separated, Kaya pulled Thomas's head down to rest against her chest, her hand stroking through his hair. The steady beat of her heart was like a drum, primal and reassuring. Thomas closed his eyes and let himself be held. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He could feel that as certainly as he could feel the ache in his bruised muscles. Goyakla's challenge hadn't been resolved, merely postponed. The division in the camp would only deepen as long as Thomas remained. But tonight, wrapped in Kaya's fierce protection, Thomas allowed himself to feel safe, allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't just staying because he had no choice. He was staying because leaving Kaya felt impossible. She'd claimed him, yes, but somewhere in the past 4 days, he'd claimed her right back. The desk clerk from Boston was gone. In his place was someone new. Someone still being forged in the brutal crucible of Kaya's expectations. Someone who was learning that strength came in forms he'd never imagined. That gentleness and violence could exist in the same person. That being chosen was both a gift and a responsibility. Outside, the rain had stopped. The desert night was quiet except for the distant call of a night bird and the soft breathing of the warrior woman who held him. Thomas drifted back toward sleep, his body exhausted but his mind strangely at peace. Whatever test Kaya had put him through today, he must have passed. She'd looked at him afterward with something close to pride, had defended him against her own people. He belonged to her, and increasingly, impossibly, that felt less like captivity and more like home. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean. Thomas woke to find Kaya already preparing for something, checking weapons, gathering supplies into a leather pack with focused intensity. When she noticed him watching, she gestured for him to get up and dress quickly. The camp was unusually quiet, most of the warriors still sleeping after the late-night argument. Kaya moved with deliberate stealth, clearly not wanting to draw attention. She handed Thomas a piece of dried meat and motioned for him to eat while walking. They left camp heading north, following a game trail that wound through increasingly rough terrain. Thomas's body protested every step. Yesterday's brutal training had left him stiff and aching, but he kept pace without complaint. He was learning that complaint was pointless with Kaya. She expected him to endure, and so he did. After an hour of steady walking, Kaya stopped and knelt by the trail. She gestured for Thomas to join her, then pointed at marks in the dust. Hoofprints, he realized, though larger than any horse he'd seen. Deer, Thomas said, though he had no idea if he was right. Kaya shook her head and spoke a word in Apache, then held her hands apart to indicate size. Something big. She stood and continued following the tracks with Thomas trailing behind, and he began to understand. They were hunting. The realization sent a jolt of anxiety through him. Thomas had never hunted anything in his life. His father had considered hunting a barbaric pursuit, suitable only for men with more brawn than brains. The closest Thomas had come was seeing dressed game hanging in Boston markets. They tracked for another 2 hours, Kaya reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to Thomas's untrained eyes. She moved with absolute silence, her footsteps making no sound even on loose gravel. Thomas tried to copy her movements but felt clumsy and loud by comparison. Finally, Kaya held up a hand, signaling him to stop. She pointed ahead to where the trail opened into a small clearing surrounded by juniper trees. Thomas squinted but saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye. A massive elk, its coat the color of rust, grazing on the sparse vegetation. Kaya drew her bow, a weapon Thomas hadn't seen her use before, and knocked an arrow with fluid efficiency. She took aim, her muscular arms steady and sure, and for a moment Thomas thought she would simply kill the animal and their hunt would be over. Instead, she lowered the bow and turned to him. She pulled a second bow from where it had been strapped to her pack and handed it to Thomas along with several arrows. Thomas stared at the weapon, then at Kaya, then back at the elk. She couldn't be serious. He'd never even held a bow before, let alone used one. There was no possible way he could. Kaya's expression was implacable. She positioned the bow in his hands, correcting his grip, showing him how to nock the arrow. Her hands guided his, demonstrating the proper draw, the way to anchor and aim. She did this several times, patient but firm, until Thomas understood the basic mechanics. Then she stepped back and pointed at the elk. Thomas's heart hammered. The elk was perhaps 40 yards away, peacefully unaware of their presence. It was a beautiful animal, powerful and graceful. The thought of trying to kill it made Thomas's stomach churn. But Kaya was watching him with that same testing expression she'd worn yesterday during their fight. This was another trial, another measure of whether he could become what she needed him to be. Thomas raised the bow, his arms shaking slightly. He tried to remember Kaya's instructions. Feet shoulder-width apart, draw back to his anchor point, breathe steadily. The arrow wobbled as he drew it back. His muscles, unused to this motion, burned with the effort of holding the draw. He aimed at the elk's chest and released. The arrow flew wild, missing the animal by at least 10 feet and clattering harmlessly into the rocks beyond. The elk's head snapped up, alert to danger. Kaya made a soft sound, not quite disappointment, more like expectation confirmed. She moved behind Thomas and positioned his body more precisely, her hands firm on his shoulders, his hips, adjusting his stance. Then she handed him another arrow. The elk was still visible, now wary and tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of real threat. Thomas knocked the arrow, tried to apply what Kaya had just corrected. This time when he drew back, his stance felt more stable. He sighted along the arrow, remembered his father's words about having a good head for details, for calculations. He tried to factor in distance, wind, the slight downward angle. He was released. The arrow flew closer this time, but still missed, striking the ground near the elk's feet. The animal exploded into motion, bounding away with powerful grace that made it seem to float across the rocky ground. Thomas expected Kaya to look angry or disappointed. Instead, when he turned to her, she was smiling. Not her usual possessive smile, but something different. Pride, maybe, or approval. She spoke in Apache, her tone encouraging, then gestured for him to follow. They tracked the elk again, moving quickly now that the animal knew it was being hunted. The trail led them higher into the hills, across terrain that had Thomas gasping for air. They jumped the elk twice more that morning. Each time, Kaya positioned Thomas for a shot, corrected his form, let him try. Each time he missed, though his shots were getting progressively closer. The elk, increasingly spooked, led them on a chase that consumed the entire morning and stretched into the afternoon. Thomas was exhausted, his fingers raw from the bowstring, his arms trembling from repeatedly drawing the bow. But something was shifting inside him. Each failed shot taught him something. Each correction from Kaya refined his understanding. He was learning. The fourth time they caught up with the elk, it was standing in a narrow ravine, cornered by the terrain. This time, when Kaya positioned Thomas for the shot, she stayed close behind him, her body pressed against his back, her hands guiding his arms into perfect position. She spoke softly in Apache, right next to his ear. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. This time, do it this time. He drew the bow back, his muscles screaming. Kaya's hand steadied his, her strength supporting him. The elk stood broadside, perhaps 30 yards away, still wary but momentarily trapped. Thomas breathed out slowly and released. The arrow flew true. It struck the elk high in the chest, and the animal stumbled. Not a clean kill. Thomas knew that immediately, but a solid hit. The elk bolted from the ravine, but its movements were labored now, weakening. Kaya let out a sharp cry, an ululation of triumph, and grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, spinning him around. Her face was alight with fierce joy, and she kissed him hard, right there in the open, celebrating his success. Then she was moving, tracking the wounded elk with renewed intensity. Thomas followed, his heart still hammering from the shot, from Kaya's reaction. They found the elk 20 minutes later, collapsed in a small clearing, Thomas's arrow still protruding from its chest. Kaya approached carefully, drew her knife, and quickly finished what Thomas had started. She knelt beside the dead animal and began speaking in Apache, what sounded like a prayer or thanks. She gestured for Thomas to join her. When he knelt beside her, she took his hand and placed it on the elk's still warm flank. She continued speaking, and though Thomas didn't know the words, he understood this was important, a ritual of respect for the animal's sacrifice. When the prayer was finished, Kaya began the work of field dressing the elk with practiced efficiency. She showed Thomas how to help, guiding his hands through the process. It was bloody, visceral work, nothing like the sanitized meat that had appeared on his family's dinner table back in Boston. But Kaya made it seem almost sacred. Nothing wasted. Every part treated with care and purpose. They worked together for over an hour, Kaya teaching Thomas about butchering, about which cuts were best for what purposes, about how to preserve the hide. His hands were red with blood by the time they finished, and he felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Kaya built a small fire and roasted strips of meat from the elk's liver. She fed Thomas the first piece, warm and rich and unlike anything he'd tasted before. Then she ate, and they sat together in companionable silence, sharing their kill. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Kaya showed Thomas how to construct a travois from branches and rope to drag the meat back to camp. It was ingenious and practical, and Thomas found himself impressed by the elegant simplicity of the design. They started the journey back, taking turns pulling the heavy load. The work was exhausting, but Kaya seemed pleased. not just with the successful hunt, but with Thomas himself. She kept looking at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Satisfaction that her investment in him was paying off. They reached camp as full darkness fell. The warriors were gathered around the fires, and conversation stopped as Kaya and Thomas emerged from the darkness, pulling their travois loaded with fresh meat. Goyakla stood, his expression thunderous. He said something sharp in Apache, gesturing at Thomas with obvious contempt. Several other warriors looked between him and Kaya, tension crackling in the air. Kaya's response was to walk directly to the center of the camp, pulling Thomas with her. She called out loudly, her voice carrying to every corner of the canyon. Then she pointed at the travois at Thomas and spoke at length. Thomas didn't need translation to understand what she was saying. She was telling them about the hunt, about Thomas's kill. She was claiming his success as proof of his worth. The reaction was mixed. Some warriors nodded approvingly. Meat was meat, and a successful hunt spoke for itself. Others remained hostile, Goyakla chief among them. The scarred warrior spat into the fire and stalked away, but several of his closest allies remained, their expressions hard. Naichi, however, approached with an approving smile. She examined the elk meat, nodded, and spoke to Kaya with what sounded like genuine praise. Then she turned to Thomas and said something in Apache that made several nearby warriors laugh, but this time the laughter didn't feel mocking. That night's feast was different from previous nights. Warriors who had been ignoring Thomas now nodded to him as they passed. Young boys who'd been throwing rocks near him earlier in the week now watched with something closer to respect. The elk meat was distributed throughout the camp, and Kaya made sure everyone knew who had made the kill. Kaya herself seemed transformed, relaxed in a way Thomas hadn't seen before. She sat with him by the fire, her arm casually draped around his shoulders, publicly claiming him without defensiveness. When warriors spoke to her, she responded with easy confidence, occasionally pointing at Thomas or squeezing his shoulder. One of the younger warriors, a man named Cochise, who'd been relatively neutral toward Thomas, approached and spoke directly to him in halting, broken English. "Good. Shoot," Cochise said, miming drawing a bow. "You learn fast." Thomas was so surprised to hear English that he almost didn't respond. "Thank you," he managed. "Kaya is a good teacher." Cochise grinned and said something in Apache that made Kaya laugh. A real laugh, full and uninhibited. She responded with something that made Cochise laugh in turn, and Thomas got the distinct impression they were teasing each other. As the night wore on and warriors began drifting to their shelters, Kaya finally stood and pulled Thomas to his feet. But instead of leading him directly to her shelter, she took him to the edge of the camp where they could see the desert stretching away under starlight. She stood behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her chin resting on top of his head. They stayed like that for several minutes, just looking out at the vast landscape. Thomas felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing, felt the solid strength of her body supporting his. Kaya spoke softly in Apache, a long string of words that Thomas couldn't understand, but the tone was different than usual, reflective, almost vulnerable. She was sharing something important with him, something personal. When she finished, Thomas turned in her arms to face her. "I wish I understood," he said quietly. Kaya touched his face, her expression gentle. Then she spoke one word he did know, one of the first words she'd taught him. Soon. She led him to her shelter, and that night their intimacy was different. slower, more tender. Kaya took her time exploring his body, as if rediscovering it after some absence. When Thomas touched her in return, she let him take the lead more than usual, let him learn her body at his own pace. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Thomas spoke into the darkness. "I killed something today," he said softly. "I took a life. I should feel guilty about that, shouldn't I? Back in Boston, killing anything would have been unthinkable. But I don't feel guilty. I feel proud. Is that wrong?" Kaya's hand stroked through his hair, a gesture he'd come to associate with comfort and approval. "You're changing me," Thomas continued. "I'm becoming someone I don't recognize, someone who can fight and hunt and survive out here, someone who belongs with you. And the strange thing is, I don't want to go back to who I was. That man was invisible, useless. You look at me and see someone capable of becoming more, someone worth teaching, worth keeping." He paused, struggling with the next words. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he whispered. "Is that insane? You kidnapped me. You can't even understand most of what I'm saying. But I look at you, and I feel more alive than I ever did in 24 years of civilized life. You make me want to be stronger, braver, better. You make me want to deserve you." Kaya responded in Apache, her voice soft and serious. And though Thomas still couldn't understand the words, he understood the meaning in her tone, in the way her arms tightened around him. "I am making you mine, not just in body but in spirit. And you are letting me, and that makes you worthy." Thomas closed his eyes and let himself drift toward sleep, held fast in Kaya's embrace. Outside, the desert night was quiet. The camp was at peace, at least for now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Goyakla's hostility hadn't disappeared. If anything, Thomas's success might fuel it further. The division in the camp still existed. The fundamental question of whether a white man belonged here still unanswered. But tonight, Thomas had proven something to himself as much as to the Apache warriors. He could learn. He could adapt. He could become something more than the frightened clerk who'd been dragged from a burning fort. And he had Kaya. Fierce, demanding, impossible Kaya, who looked at him like he was something precious worth fighting for. That, Thomas decided as sleep claimed him, was worth any price. The trouble started 3 days after the hunt. Thomas was helping Nachi tan the elk hide, working the leather with a smooth stone as she'd taught him, when Goyakla approached with 2 other warriors. Kaya was away from camp, scouting the northern approaches with Cochise and another warrior. Thomas was alone with the older women and a few of the younger children. Goyakla said something in Apache, his tone sharp and mocking. The 2 warriors with him laughed. Thomas kept his eyes on his work, remembering Kaya's lessons about not showing fear, about maintaining dignity even when threatened. The scarred warrior stepped closer and kicked over the bowl of tanning mixture Thomas had been using. The liquid spilled across the hide, ruining hours of careful work. Nachi stood immediately, her voice rising in anger as she berated Goyakla. But the warrior ignored her, stepping around her to stand directly in front of Thomas. He was shorter than Kaya but broader, his chest scarred from what looked like old battle wounds. His eyes held nothing but contempt. He spoke again, clearly directing his words at Thomas this time. When Thomas didn't respond, Goyakla grabbed the front of his shirt and yanked him to his feet. Thomas's heart hammered, but he forced himself to meet the warrior's eyes. Kaya had taught him that much. Never look away first. Never show weakness. Goyakla shoved him backward. Thomas stumbled but didn't fall. The warrior laughed and said something that made his two companions grin viciously. Then he shoved Thomas again, harder this time. This was a challenge. Thomas understood that much. Goyakla was testing him, trying to provoke him into a fight he couldn't possibly win. If Thomas fought back and lost, which he would, it would prove that Kaya's faith in him was misplaced. If he didn't fight back, it would prove he was a coward. There was no winning move, except the one Kaya had shown him during their training. Thomas stood his ground. When Goyakla shoved him a third time, Thomas absorbed the impact, keeping his feet planted. His body was stronger now than it had been a week ago. Not strong enough to match an Apache warrior, but stronger than the soft clerk who'd hidden behind a desk. "I won't fight you," Thomas said in careful Apache, using words Kaya had taught him. The pronunciation was terrible, but understandable. Goyakla's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with renewed anger. The fact that Thomas was learning their language seemed to infuriate him even more. He spat at Thomas's feet and spoke rapidly, his voice rising. Nachi tried to intervene again, but one of Goyakla's companions held her back. The older woman struggled, shouting what were clearly threats, but she was outmatched. Goyakla drew his knife. The camp had gone silent. Other warriors were watching now, drawn by the commotion. Thomas saw faces in the crowd, some hostile, some troubled, a few openly curious about what would happen next. The scarred warrior pressed the blade against Thomas's throat, in almost the exact spot where Kaya had cut him during their training. He spoke slowly, making sure Thomas understood. The meaning was clear even without a perfect translation. "You don't belong here. You make us weak. You should die." Thomas's mouth was dry, but he kept his voice steady. "Kaya decides," he said in broken Apache. "Not you." It was the wrong thing to say. Goyakla's face contorted with rage, and for a moment Thomas was certain the blade would sink home. The warrior's hand trembled with barely controlled fury. Then a voice cut across the camp like a whip crack. Kaya stood at the canyon entrance, bow in hand and arrow nocked and drawn. The arrow was pointed directly at Goyakla's chest. Her face was absolutely calm, but her eyes burned with lethal intent. She spoke one word, a command. Goyakla didn't lower his knife. Instead, he shouted back at her, his voice full of rage and frustration. What followed was a rapid exchange. Goyakla arguing, gesturing violently at Thomas, his voice growing more agitated. Kaya responding with cold, clipped sentences that somehow carried more weight than all of Goyakla's volume. Finally, the scarred warrior said something that made several onlookers gasp. It sounded like a formal challenge. Kaya's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a coil in tension, like a snake preparing to strike. She lowered her bow slightly and spoke a single word. Goyakla removed his knife from Thomas's throat and stepped back, a savage grin spreading across his face. He'd gotten what he wanted. Kaya handed her bow to Cochise and walked into the center of the camp. She began removing her weapons, knives, hatchet, a small blade from her boot, piling them carefully to one side. Goyakla did the same. still grinning that vicious grin. Thomas's stomach clenched with understanding. They were going to fight, really fight, and he had caused it. Nietzsche appeared beside him, gripping his arm tightly. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and though Thomas only caught fragments, he understood she was telling him this was serious, dangerous. The warriors formed a loose circle around Kaya and Goyakla. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation. This was more than a simple dispute. This was about leadership, about the direction of the group, about whether Kaya's choice to claim Thomas was wisdom or weakness. The fight began without ceremony. Goyakla moved first, lunging at Kaya with a speed that shocked Thomas, but Kaya was faster. She sidestepped his charge and drove her elbow into his ribs, hard enough that Thomas heard the impact from yards away. Goyakla grunted but recovered quickly, spinning to face her. They circled each other, and Thomas could see the scarred warrior reassessing. He'd underestimated Kaya's speed. They came together in a flurry of strikes, punches, kicks, grappling. Both fighters were skilled, both brutal. Goyakla had weight and battle experience. Kaya had reach and power. They traded blows that would have dropped Thomas instantly, neither giving ground. Goyakla managed to land a solid punch to Kaya's jaw that snapped her head back. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. But instead of retreating, Kaya smiled. That same devastating smile she'd given Thomas the first time they'd met. She pressed her attack, driving Goyakla backward with a combination of strikes that were too fast for Thomas to follow individually. The scarred warrior blocked most of them, but enough got through to leave him bloodied and staggering. He changed tactics, going low and tackling Kaya around the waist. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the hard-packed earth. The watching warriors shouted, some cheering for Goyakla, others for Kaya. It was impossible to tell who held the advantage. They broke apart and scrambled to their feet simultaneously. Both were breathing hard now, both bleeding from multiple cuts and scrapes. Goyakla's left eye was swelling shut. Kaya moved with a slight limp that suggested her knee had taken damage, but neither showed any sign of stopping. The fight continued, brutal and relentless. Thomas watched in horror and awe, unable to look away. This was what Kaya truly was. Not just the patient teacher who'd shown him how to survive. Not just the demanding lover who'd claimed him in the night. This was a warrior in her element, fighting for dominance, for the right to make her own choices. Fighting for him. Goyakla landed a kick to Kaya's injured knee that made her stumble. He pressed the advantage, raining blows down on her as she tried to recover her balance. For a terrible moment, Thomas thought she might fall. Instead, she caught Goyakla's next punch, trapped his arm, and used his own momentum to flip him over her hip. The scarred warrior hit the ground hard, and before he could recover, Kaya was on him. What followed was brutal efficiency. Kaya mounted Goyakla's chest, her knees pinning his arms. She struck him once, twice, 3 times, measured blows to his face that left him dazed and bleeding. Then she stopped. She sat there, straddling him, her fist raised for another blow, but she didn't deliver it. Instead, she spoke, a question, based on the inflection. Goyakla turned his head to the side, a gesture of submission. Kaya held the position a moment longer, making sure every warrior present understood what had happened. Then she stood, stepping off Goyakla's chest. She was bleeding, limping, her face already showing bruises, but she stood tall, her chin raised. She spoke to the assembled warriors, her voice carrying despite her obvious exhaustion. Thomas didn't understand all the words, but he understood the meaning. This is settled. The white man stays. Anyone who challenges this challenges me. No one spoke. Even Goyakala's closest allies remained silent. Kaya turned and walked directly to Thomas. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, that now familiar grip that meant possession, protection. She pulled him away from the crowd, back toward her shelter. Inside, away from watching eyes, Kaya finally allowed herself to show pain. She lowered herself carefully onto the blankets, wincing as her injured knee bent. Blood dripped from a cut above her eyebrow, and her knuckles were split and swelling. Thomas moved without thinking, grabbing the water skin and clean cloths. He knelt beside her and began cleaning her wounds with the same careful attention she and Naichi had shown him after his fights. Kaya watched him work, her expression unreadable. When he touched a particularly painful spot, she didn't flinch or pull away, just kept watching him with those dark, intense eyes. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly, knowing she might not understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the tone. "This is my fault. You shouldn't have to fight your own people because of me." He continued cleaning her wounds, his hands as gentle as he could make them. When he'd finished, he sat back and met her eyes. "Tell me what you want from me," he said. "Tell me what I need to become to be worth this, worth risking everything." Kaya reached out and cupped his face in her battered hand. She spoke in Apache, several sentences, her voice soft but serious. Thomas caught a few words now. Strong, learn, mine, stay. Then she pulled him down beside her, ignoring her injuries to wrap her arms around him. She held him tightly, possessively, and Thomas understood. She'd fought for the right to keep him. Now she was collecting what she'd won. They lay together in silence for a long time. Outside, the camp gradually returned to normal activity, voices rising as warriors discussed the fight, children playing, the everyday sounds of life continuing. But something fundamental had shifted. Kaya had publicly claimed Thomas and defended that claim against the strongest opposition. There would still be warriors who resented his presence, but after today, none would openly challenge it. Thomas turned in Kaya's arms to face her. Her face was already swelling from Goyakala's blows, blood crusted at the corner of her mouth. She'd never looked more beautiful to him. "I won't let you fight alone next time," he said quietly. "I don't care if I lose. I don't care if I get hurt. You stood up for me. Next time I stand up too." Kaya smiled, a small, tired smile that transformed her battered face. She said something in Apache that might have been approval or might have been affection. Then she kissed him, gentle despite her split lip. That night, they didn't make love. Instead, they simply held each other, both too battered and exhausted for anything more. But the intimacy felt deeper somehow. Not the claiming of bodies, but the claiming of souls. Thomas understood now what he hadn't fully grasped before. Kaya hadn't just taken him as a captive or a curiosity. She'd chosen him with full knowledge of what that choice would cost her. She'd risked her standing, her relationships with her people, her own safety, all for a man who'd been nothing but a frightened clerk when she'd first seen him. Why? He still didn't fully understand, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered was that she had chosen him, and he was choosing her right back, choosing this life over his old one, choosing strength over safety, choosing a woman who looked at him and saw not what he was but what he could become. As sleep took him, still wrapped in Kaya's arms, Thomas made a silent promise. He would become worthy of her choice. He would learn everything she had to teach him. He would transform himself from the frightened clerk into someone who could stand beside her, not behind her. He would become the man she saw when she looked at him with those fierce, possessive eyes. And if that meant leaving behind everything he'd been before, every safe assumption about who he was supposed to be, then so be it. The old Thomas Caldwell was dead. Kaya had killed him the moment she decided he was hers. What emerged from those ashes would be something new entirely. 3 weeks after the fight, soldiers came. Thomas was gathering water from the spring when Cochise appeared, moving fast and silent. The young warrior grabbed Thomas's arm and pulled him back toward camp, speaking rapidly in Apache. Thomas caught enough words to understand. Blue coats, horses, tracking. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Warriors grabbed weapons and supplies with practiced efficiency. Women gathered children, preparing to move deeper into the canyon system. Naichi pressed a knife into Thomas's hand, his own knife now, given to him by Kaya after the hunt, and spoke urgently. Kaya emerged from her shelter already armed, her face set in grim determination. When she saw Thomas, something flickered across her expression. Fear, maybe, or calculation. She crossed to him in 3 strides and gripped both his shoulders, staring into his eyes. She spoke rapidly, and Thomas understood the essential question. The soldiers are your people. Do you want to go back? Thomas looked at her. This woman who transformed him from invisible to essential, from weak to capable, from alone to claimed. Her face still bore faint bruises from the fight with Goyakla. Her hands, gripping his shoulders, were calloused from a lifetime of survival. She'd risked everything for him. No, he said in Apache, the word clear and certain. I stay with you. Relief flooded Kaya's face, followed immediately by fierce determination. She kissed him hard, claiming him one more time, then pulled him toward the canyon wall where the warriors were gathering. The plan became clear quickly. Most of the group would retreat deeper into the canyon system, taking paths the soldiers couldn't follow on horseback. A small group of warriors, Kaya, Cochise, Goyakla, and 3 others, would lay a false trail leading away from the main group's escape route. Thomas expected to be sent with the women and children. Instead, Kaya kept him at her side, pressing a bow into his hands. She spoke to the other warriors, her tone brooking no argument. Goyakla looked like he wanted to protest but said nothing. The scarred warrior's face was still healing from their fight, a visible reminder of who led here. They moved out, 6 warriors and 1 former army clerk, running across terrain that would have killed Thomas a month ago. Now his body responded with efficiency he'd never imagined possible. His lungs burned but didn't fail. His legs ached but kept moving. He'd become someone different. They laid the false trail with deliberate care. Broken branches, disturbed ground, signs obvious enough for army trackers to follow. Kaya led them in a wide arc away from where the main group had fled, deeper into the Badlands where the landscape became a maze of identical red rock formations. They heard the soldiers before they saw them. The jingle of tack, the sound of hooves on stone, voices calling out in English. Thomas's heart clenched at those familiar sounds. Those were his people, speaking his language, following orders from officers he might have known. Except they weren't his people anymore. The Apache warriors took positions among the rocks, preparing an ambush. Kaya positioned Thomas in a sheltered spot with clear sight lines down the trail. She checked his bow, corrected his stance one final time, then looked into his eyes with a question she didn't need to speak aloud. Could he do this? Could he shoot at the men he'd served alongside? Thomas thought about Lieutenant Morrison, dead at Fort Stanton, about Sergeant Williamson with an arrow in his back, about the casual contempt every soldier had shown him, the way they'd looked through him like he didn't exist. Then he thought about Kaya's hand in his, about learning to hunt and fight and survive, about being sane, being chosen, being transformed into someone who mattered. "I'm ready," he said. The soldiers came into view, a patrol of perhaps 15 men, led by a young lieutenant Thomas didn't recognize. They were following the false trail exactly as planned. Confident and careless in that uniquely cavalry way, Kaya waited until they were fully committed to the narrow trail, then gave a sharp whistle. Arrows flew from multiple positions. 2 soldiers dropped immediately, one clutching his throat, another falling from his saddle with an arrow in his chest. The patrol erupted into chaos, horses rearing, men shouting, officers trying to restore order. Thomas drew his bow and aimed at a sergeant who was attempting to rally the troops. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. He released. The arrow took the sergeant in the shoulder, spinning him around. Not a kill shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. Thomas knocked another arrow, his movement smooth and automatic. Everything Kaya had drilled into him. The soldiers returned fire, but they were exposed and panicked. The Apache warriors moved between positions like ghosts, appearing long enough to loose arrows, then vanishing before return fire could find them. It was brutally efficient. Thomas shot 3 more times, hitting twice. Each time he released an arrow at men wearing the same uniform he'd once worn. He felt nothing but grim determination. These men would have killed Kaya without hesitation, would have killed all the Apache without mercy or regret. The fight lasted perhaps 5 minutes. When it was over, 6 soldiers lay dead or dying, and the rest were in full retreat, abandoning their wounded in their panic to escape the killing ground. Kaya appeared beside Thomas, checking him for injuries with quick, efficient hands. Finding none, she grabbed his face and kissed him fiercely, her eyes blazing with pride and something deeper. The warriors gathered the abandoned weapons and supplies, rifles, ammunition, food stores. Goyakla approached Thomas, looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in careful English. "You fight good," he said. Then, after a pause, "Brother." It was acceptance. Hard won and probably temporary, but real. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They returned to camp as night fell. The main group had reached safety, and the reunion was subdued but relieved. Naichi embraced Kaya, then surprised Thomas by embracing him as well, speaking rapidly in Apache with what sounded like approval. That night, the camp celebrated their successful defense. Warriors recounted the ambush, and Thomas noticed with shock that he featured in several of the stories. Cochise demonstrated Thomas's shooting stance, exaggerating for comic effect, but also clearly impressed. Kaya sat beside Thomas throughout, her hand never leaving his. She didn't participate in the storytelling, but watched the others with quiet satisfaction. When warriors praised her leadership, she deflected the credit, pointing instead at the group's coordination. Later, in the privacy of their shelter, Kaya undressed Thomas slowly, checking again for any injuries she might have missed. Her hands were gentle, thorough, caring. When she was satisfied he was unharmed, she pulled him down onto the blankets. They made love differently that night, as equals, rather than captor and captive, as partners who'd fought side by side. Kaya was still dominant, still powerful, but there was a new tenderness in her touch, a new respect in how she looked at him. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Thomas spoke into the darkness. "I shot at my own people today," he said quietly. "I should feel guilty, should feel like I betrayed something, but all I feel is grateful that you're safe." Kaya stroked his hair, listening even though she understood perhaps one word in three. "You gave me a choice at the spring," Thomas continued. "You would have let me go back if I'd wanted, but I didn't want to. I don't want to. This is where I belong now. With you. With these people. In this life." He paused, searching for the right words. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't know if you understand that phrase, but I need to say it. You took a frightened, useless clerk and made him into someone capable, someone strong. You looked at me and saw potential when everyone else saw nothing. You fought for me. You changed everything." Kaya pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the darkness. Then she spoke in Apache, several sentences, her voice soft but intense. Thomas caught a few words. "Love, mine, always, stay." She pressed her hand over his heart, then took his hand and pressed it over hers. The meaning was clear even without a perfect translation. What you feel, I feel. What you are to me, I am to you. Thomas pulled her close, and they lay there in silence, hearts beating in synchrony. Outside, the desert night was peaceful. The soldiers were gone. The camp was safe. The immediate danger had passed. But Thomas knew this life would always hold danger. The army would come again. Other threats would emerge. This existence offered no guarantees, no safety, no certainty. But it offered something more valuable: purpose, belonging. A woman who looked at him and saw not what society said he should be, but what he actually could become. Thomas Caldwell had died in the burning ruins of Fort Stanton. In his place was someone new, someone forged in the desert sun, tempered by brutal training, shaped by impossible love, someone who belonged to a warrior woman who decided he was worth keeping, and who discovered she was worth everything in return. As sleep claimed him, still held in Kaya's fierce embrace, Thomas felt something he'd never experienced in his old life: complete certainty about where he belonged. Not in Boston, counting other people's money. Not in an army fort filing endless reports. But here, in a hide shelter, in an Apache camp, wrapped in the arms of a woman who'd claimed him and transformed him and loved him in ways that had no words in either of their languages. He was hers. She was his. And that was enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the marker, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.